We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email john@nufcmatters.com to arrange today. A big thanks to all our sponsors: Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Thanks to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. Their website, mrvickies.co.uk, telephone 01768 210 102, or email info@mrvickies.co.uk. Thanks to United Group Travel. There are no strangers in our tours, just friends you haven't met yet. Their website, unitedgrouptravel.com, email beverly.ugtl@gmail.com, telephone 01670 632 460, or mobile 0791 666 4174. Thanks to Media Arts for the technical side of things. And you can also find us as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or other podcast providers. You can subscribe to the channel by hitting the subscribe button underneath this video. Hit the all notifications bell so you don't miss a show. Hit the thumb up to like the channel and click share to your social media. If you want to join the channel, then click join for as little as $1.99 a month. If you want to become a member for a one-off £25 payment, email john@nufcmatters.com or go to membership at the website nufcmatters.com. If you've got a smartphone, hold your camera over the QR code and it'll take you straight there. We also help the food bank on this channel. Go to nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk to the matchday bucket and you can leave a virtual donation today.
Critics attack. It feels like I've been talking to myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say to you,
Good morning, welcome to NUFC Matters. Hi Ben, how are you?
I'm very well, how are you?
Yeah, good to see you, mate. And first of all, congratulations, you're back in the Premier League, Leicester City.
Whew. And with a game at the time of recording to spare, which definitely a few weeks ago I thought would not be the case, but they actually finished the season very strongly. So I'm glad to be back, and now we've got to wait and see. Is it back on 0 points, minus 6 points, minus 10 points? That's the only worry, I think, from Leicester's perspective.
And Jamie Vardy signed a one-year extension as well. Do you think he can do it in the Premier League, Ben?
Yeah, I think so. And I also think from Jamie Vardy's perspective, not only is he a fantastic influence off the field, but the other thing in all of this is just a diminished kind of role. And he's had such a fantastic season in the Championship, and all credit to him, because let's not forget, he's 37 years of age. So we're not talking about early 30s here. And he's a player that's crafted his entire game on two things, really, along with all the grit and determination and other things that make you be able to climb from Stocksbridge Park Steels to Halifax to Fleetwood to Leicester and win the Premier League. But in addition to that, if we just look at the technical aspects, the dead-eye finishing, the clinical strike and the power that he generates, and that's still there. And I suppose you'd expect that because technique doesn't necessarily fade, but pace is the other thing. And he's still got that acceleration over short spaces, perhaps not as much when he's running from in and around the halfway line. But to get 20 goals in all competitions and 18 in the Championship, it's phenomenal. But what we have to remember is in the Premier League last season, he played virtually every game, some off the bench, some starting, and he only scored 3 goals. So we have to first of all wait and see whether he can still cut it at that top level. But at his age, I think he'll be absolutely fine with a diminished responsibility whereby he starts some games, he comes off the bench in some games, and he becomes a very positive dressing room influence throughout the course of the season. And that might be needed if Leicester have a young squad, an inexperienced squad in the Premier League. They're completely different to the team that went down, and Vardy can be very influential. So my sense is that his longevity at the football club is down to his relationship with the chairman, and also the fact that he's matured and people realise that Vardy is a very positive influence for Leicester, not just on the field, but off it as well.
Okay, we put out a cry for questions. We've got a few questions which we haven't had before. Try not to repeat the questions we get. I do like this one from Dick. Straight away, he says, can Ben please reenact Leicester winning the Premier League celebration by singing Nessun Dorma in the style of Andrea Bocelli, please?
Oh, Lord. I don't think that we can be doing that at 10:30 in the morning. I can give you a sort of Nessun Dorma, but that's about as much as I'm prepared to do.
I tell you what, I think you'd be very happy with that. Well done, mate. There's only me usually sings badly on here, so it's nice to have some.
I need like the accompanying track. What we can do is if there's a Nessun Dorma track brought up, singing along when I have time to get karaoke style words, that's fine. But singing solo, I'm kind of lucky though, because where I'm recording has got very high ceilings, so there is a decent echo. And I feel that that was a sort of 6 out of 10 Nessun Dorma.
Yeah, great stuff, mate. Tom Dixon says, do you think Newcastle might go for Rashford if he's available for 25 million? And if not, do you think you would? Where do you think he would go if he leaves Manchester United?
Rashford, I think, won't be available at anywhere near that number. That's the first thing to say. I also don't think he's leaving Manchester United. By the way, we hear a lot of rumours and speculation because his form has ultimately diminished. But from what I'm told, Rashford actually relishes the chance to prove his critics wrong and be part of this new Sir Jim Ratcliffe-led era. So given the wages he's on and the fact that he only recently signed a new contract, I'd be very surprised if he's one of the outgoings at Manchester United. And I think they've got plenty of other options to raise money to move in the market and to alleviate any PSR concerns. We know that Anthony Martial is going at the end of the season, very possibly Raphael Varane. And Varane, for example, won't command a fee if he ends up leaving, but it's a big chunk off the wage bill, which is an underrated way of freeing up money and bringing in other players. And then in addition to that, you've got Casemiro, you might have Christian Eriksen, even though both Harry Maguire and Scott McTominay have been quite important, very important, in fact, to Manchester United this season. I think it's fair to say that if the right offer came in for both of them, consideration would be made. And therefore, when you add that type of savings on wages or fees available, plus start talking about Mason Greenwood, Jadon Sancho, Anthony, even potentially Rashford, in terms of the fee that he might command and the necessity to sell, will not be there in the conversation, in my opinion. But if he is to be, regardless of this season, his potential based on last season's incredible numbers and the length of time left on the contract and the age and the profile will all mean that that's likely a 60, 70, 80 million even valuation. I mean, Mason Greenwood is ballpark 40 million. Jadon Sancho, the quoted figures from a year or so ago were 50 million, and he's been in good form so far for Dortmund. So Rashford is going to be more than those players for sure. So you're not talking about a cut price deal. And I don't see Newcastle being in the conversation. I also think that if we get to an eventuality where, with a long period of his contract left, Manchester United feel the need to sell Rashford, and as importantly, Rashford says he would like to leave Old Trafford, we're likely not talking about a sale to a Premier League club. I don't think that would sit right with Ineos at this point. Anyway, let's see whether anything changes in the next year or 2 years, because the player's a bit older. Manchester United could be in a different position. But I think that Ineos would see it as less preferable, a bit like when Harry Kane went to Bayern and Manchester United investigated and they got one set of intel, which was essentially Levy's going to be difficult to work with and he doesn't want to sell to a Premier League club and the price is going to be 100 million plus. And then when Bayern came calling, it was a slightly different situation because Kane said he wanted to go and Levy felt like it was easier to deal with a non-Premier League club and not see Kane banging in 43 goals in 43 games for a rival as they go up the table, while Spurs, obviously, as we saw last night, are stuttering and moving slightly in the wrong direction as far as Champions League qualification is concerned. So I think that's the other thing in all of this, that Rashford falls into that category, despite the fact he's had a very poor season comparative to last campaign. Dealing Premier League to Premier League is not something I think Manchester United would consider, even for a healthy offer of 60, 70, 80 million. And as I said right at the beginning, I think they've got other ways of getting to the 100 million or so of outgoings that I'm told that they're looking for.
Okay, Brian Kreutz, good morning. He says, please ask Ben why so many are saying that the current financial rules are protecting those already established clubs. And he seems to think that the opposite, or at least that's how he comes across on your last show. So he watched the last show and he felt that's the way you were coming across, Ben.
Yeah, that's my feeling, that the financial rules as of now, if we're specifically talking about PSR, are not protecting the big six clubs, if you like. If anything, they're hampering them, which is why we're seeing a drive for a change. So if we're specifically talking about profit and sustainability, and I'll boil it down into simple terms, you can make £105 million of losses over a 3-year period if you're an established Premier League club over those 3 years in play. If you've come up, it's different. If you go down, then come up, it's a little bit different in terms of the numbers. But just for simplicity, because we're talking about the bigger clubs in the question, 105 million over 3 years. And the reason why I say it's not protecting the big six is, one, because everybody voted for this, and it doesn't just need 6 clubs, it needs a 2/3 majority. So everybody bought into this, and if they didn't like it, big club, medium club, small club, by Premier League standards, all clubs are big clubs in my view, with great fan bases, but by Premier League standards comparatively, big size clubs, medium size clubs, or small size clubs, financially speaking, I mean, they all voted for it, or at least 2/3 of them drove it through. So we can't say that this was done under duress. We can't say it was done by a minority. And the other thing is, in this inflated market, the 105 million of allowable losses over 3 years doesn't help the big six clubs, because they're the ones that are spending crazy amounts of money. And some of them are able to bring in a lot of revenue via commercial deals or potentially player sales. But we're finding Arsenal sign Declan Rice, Kai Havertz and Jurrien Timber in the same window. Liverpool do a midfield revamp. In the same window, Chelsea get a player like Moises Caicedo and several others. Even Cole Palmer was 45 million. And then you head into January and they all did nothing. And then you head into the summer and what are we hearing? Chelsea need 100 million in outgoings. Manchester United need 100 million in outgoings. Arsenal have David Raya, and they have to structure that. That's obviously a historical deal in a loan to buy because of PSR. And again, Arsenal are not suddenly going to be able to find 100 million for Bruno Guimaraes potentially, and they're certainly not going to be able to make offers of 100 million for Alexander Isak and Bruno Guimaraes. Not again, just before everyone screams at me that Newcastle want to really sell either of them, but certainly not Isak. But I'm talking financially and hypothetically, even if they wanted to, they're not in that position. And then you got PSG, Mbappe is going to Real Madrid. They freed up 200 million euros gross, and they can be looking at Osimhen or Sesko. They might be in the mix for Bruno Guimaraes if they trigger his release clause, and they can bring in a centre-back as well and spend around 200 or even potentially 300 million euros. So about 250 million quid. So if these financial rules were protecting the big six clubs, then the logic would be that nobody lower down the hierarchy of the Premier League can do anything. And then those clubs would all be the ones that are all being punished. And then the big clubs would still be spending as they like and going unpunished. And that's just not the case. The big clubs are restricted, not protected by these financial rules. So for those of you listening that kind of buy into a collective big six power play, which I don't think really exists if you look at how the vote works, like the anchoring vote for the cap, which we can maybe come on to in a bit. So I won't detour, but do look that up if you're not clear what I'm talking about. That had 3 clubs vote against it only: Manchester City, Manchester United, and Aston Villa. And then Chelsea abstained. So that's not 6 block voting either. And again, that pertains to a change to the financial rules, a provisional one that may or may not be ratified in an AGM in June. So we're not really seeing the collective big six anymore. In previous votes, we've seen Man City and Newcastle come together. And at other times, we've seen Sheffield United randomly vote along with Newcastle and Manchester City. And some say that that's because Sheffield United Saudi and Newcastle Saudi. And it's almost like a Middle East block because Manchester City are obviously Abu Dhabi in the UAE. But who knows? Because ultimately these votes are private. And sometimes as a journalist, you learn the club, but you don't necessarily understand exactly why. You can just make a conclusion based on what sources imply. And there's always whispers and there's always conspiracies in many ways between different executives of different clubs that spin you on why things are happening. And as a journalist, you have to put scrutiny on that and come up with your own balanced reporting. But just sort of coming back to the key point in all of this, I think that Newcastle fans often ask me, aren't the financial rules stopping us from getting back into the Champions League? Aren't they protecting the existing hierarchy? And aren't they damaging the ambitions of smaller clubs to move higher and higher and higher up the Premier League? But I'm not so sure. I think that the top English clubs historically have not done well in Europe this season. They've not been able to spend in January. Many of them this summer are going to have to sell to make sure that they're okay within these supposed financial rules that protect them. And then, of course, the last thing that people always say is, but isn't it clear that Everton and Forest get charged and Newcastle can't have any leeway in the market because of these rules? And yet Manchester City are still uncharged and Chelsea are still uncharged, or rather Manchester City are charged, but their hearing hasn't concluded and Chelsea are still being investigated. But I think we have to be very clear that every case is different. So Everton are charged less because of the financial rules in place and more because in this monitoring cycle, they haven't completed the 777 takeover and they are building a new stadium. And there's dispute as to whether, having loaned money to build their new stadium, the interest payments can be offset, or whether they actually have to count towards the losses, the borrowing side of things and the accrued interest, whether that counts or doesn't count. And Everton essentially say it's everything related to our new stadium that tips the balance against us, and we're being double punished over an overlap within 2 different cycles, and the 777 takeover that we thought would be done by now hasn't been done by now. So that's a very atypical situation. And with Nottingham Forest, it just relates to one sale with Brennan Johnson, who they thought might go to Brentford. And had he done so earlier, Forest argue they're fine. But he delayed. He didn't want to go to Brentford. He didn't want to go to Atletico Madrid. He ended up joining Spurs. Spurs were waiting for the Harry Kane sale. The transfer got done much later. And as a consequence, there was no ability to put it on the financial books that Brentford wanted to. They had to push it to the following year. And that meant that they, unfortunately, went over the threshold, so got punished. But every other club seems okay within PSR at the moment. We're not seeing any other points deductions as yet. Leicester are obviously the only one to watch because that will go to an independent panel. And it looks like, unfortunately for me, they might start with a points deduction next season. But the Manchester City charges are very different. They're not about these financial rules specifically, or only anyway. They're not about the current 3-year cycle. They are historical. And there's all manner of charges, and it's much more complicated. And people always say, how is it Everton gets heard really quickly and Forest gets heard really quickly, but Manchester City doesn't? Well, Forest charge is basically just one about Brennan Johnson, and Everton's charge is plural or a bit more complicated, but they all pertain to the same kind of thing around their new stadium. And Manchester City's charges are 115. And they're historical, which means that maybe you have to dig a little bit more to find all of the information necessary. And if you look at Everton being able to challenge effectively just one charge, I know when it's listed, it's a few more than that, but it all pertains to one thing. And if you look at the Nottingham Forest one, which is the simplest, those still have taken anywhere between 9 months and a year. And even if things have seeped out during that period, we won't get the written reasons for the Everton case in likelihood until after the season. We'll get a decision on it, but we won't get the written reasons until after. And it will be the same with Forest as well, because this is kind of the legal process and you can bury it and you can delay it. Why do you think, for example, Leicester challenged and were very aggressive against the EFL and the Premier League, saying we need to clarify the jurisdiction? They did so because it delays it. And if you delay it, then you run out of time. And if you run out of time, you can't get a points deduction this season. So then Leicester go up and they mitigate the risk by burying the EFL and the Premier League in paperwork for getting any kind of points deduction this season, which means they go up. Whereas if they got even a 4-point deduction and anything else, potentially, they would have found themselves out of the automatic promotion spots and into the playoffs, and then it might have cost them promotion. So come back to Manchester City and the 115. If every single 115 of those charges can be buried in paperwork, buried in back and forth, and the independent panel have to go through 115 different things, of course it's going to take, you could argue in ratio to Nottingham Forest, 115 times more time to get to the point where we get any clarity. So actually, if, as is expected, in the latter part of this year, we hear more on those charges, we might find it's actually moved quite quickly. There's just a heck of a lot to get through. And with Chelsea, they're still investigating. And it's difficult because it's historical. They're looking at Abramovich, and yet Clearlake Bowley are in at Chelsea. So Clearlake Bowley may not even know the scope of everything because they've inherited a lot of the problems that are being investigated. So people, I think, say too glibly that the rules are protecting the big six and City are getting off scot-free when actually the hearings are still ongoing and actually the hearing hasn't taken place yet. It's all being compiled. It's all being prepared. It's all being disclosed at this stage. And people say Chelsea are being protected. We don't know yet because they might be charged. They might not be charged. And people say that Forest and Everton got done quickly. And again, yes, comparative to Manchester City, but they're completely different kinds of cases and completely different charges. And one is in the present monitoring cycle, and the Manchester City ones go way back, which make them much more complicated. So I think we have to be very careful with how we conclude the charges are impacting clubs, because, as I said to you before, one kind of charge is in the present and is very atypical. And I think other clubs of the size of Everton and Nottingham Forest would argue that they've got no fears of being in that position. And the other kind of charges are much more extensive and may have much more damning consequences if Manchester City are found guilty, and they may set precedents and they may send waves through football. But the bottom line here is that with the present day PSR rules, the 105 million of allowable losses in the 3-year cycle was voted for by the clubs themselves. So to argue somehow that it's a conspiracy against the medium or the small size clubs in the Premier League fails to take into account that This was approved by the Premier League clubs, including that 105 million number. And once we accept that, we have to say that if the clubs don't like it, it's a problem of their own making, in my view anyway.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it pans out. There's always going to be people not happy. This ties in, I guess, with the financial stuff. And Dick again says, is Aramco's close ties with UEFA a clever first step for the Saudis to get more influence to benefit Newcastle United via the back door?
I don't think so. I think, if anything, you should look at Aramco as Sunderland and PIF as Newcastle, because they're rivals in many ways. Of course, there'll be a shared goal commercially and to promote Saudi Arabia and tourism and Vision 2030. So there is a kind of common sports strategy, but I don't necessarily see Aramco and PIF going hand in hand regarding football. PIF at the moment are about investing, and their bag is essentially to not rely on oil and gas, and as part of Vision 2030 to make savvy investments globally to get a return on investment and make Saudi Arabia less reliant on the oil and gas sector. And in the context of sport, they're doing that through Newcastle. They're doing that via the Saudi Pro League and the clubs that they control. And let's just keep an eye and see whether PIF add another club in the relatively near future, because as some eagle-eye people may have noticed, just to go on an aside and tease something, and I don't have much more at this point other than documentation that's out there, but you may remember when we were in that will it, won't it happen phase, and every little thing was being analysed, from Companies House documents all the way through to tracking flights and so on, which I know that fans love to do. The Companies House had the holding company originally, which ended up being the entity that proceeded with Newcastle United as UKSA. And then it morphed into the Newcastle specific body. But the first original Companies House entity that was spotted, which PIF created to proceed with Newcastle, was UKSA. And now in France, Bandabin Mogren, same person that ended up creating UKSA and was briefly directly involved with Newcastle United on their board, he's now founded FRSA. And not much else is known at this point. Now, you could say, why are you creating another holding company and another company with the same kind of acronym as you used for Newcastle, unless you're going to invest somewhere in France? And we know Amanda Staveley has said on record that Bordeaux was a club they looked at. Marseille might be available this summer. It depends really on Frank McCourt and if he genuinely wants to sell. And Monaco is officially on the market for 67% of the shares. The Royal shares will remain at Monaco, but 67% of the Monaco shares are being sold. So there's a lot of opportunity this summer to invest in France, simply because there are available clubs that are looking for strategic investment, minority investment, or maybe open to an outright purchase. So let's see. I'm not in a position at this stage to say what that means beyond what I've just told you. I'm digging, and we have to be very cautious, because anything that's put out there sets off a whole catalyst of people assuming things that are maybe jumping the gun. Maybe they just like that acronym. Maybe they want to move into the French market and they're buying something outside of sport. But the point is that PIF are all about investing in entities and then running them and getting an eventual return on investment, but other things as well: exposure, promotion of Saudi Arabia, non-reliance on oil and gas, as I've said. And they're doing that with Newcastle. And the inverse of Newcastle is taking the Saudi Pro League clubs and getting them global exposure, but also fulfilling another aim, which is developing sport in Saudi Arabia ahead of Vision 2030, ahead of the 2034 World Cup, creating buzz and creating jobs and promoting a healthy lifestyle. So PIF are a part of that. So it's quite hands-on, and it's nothing really to do with the oil and gas sector. Aramco, on the other hand, are more sponsors. They are in the oil and gas sector, And they're all about putting their name out there in things like Formula One and snooker. And now with this partnership with FIFA for the Men's World Cup in 2026 and the Women's World Cup in 2027. So it's a badging, it's a promotion, it draws attention to their brand, it draws attention to Saudi Arabia, but they're not running any of these entities. They're partnering so they can be a commercial player in the game, which has the benefit of promoting the sports strategy of Saudi Arabia, or at the other extreme, sports washing. And again, I say both because we have to put scrutiny on both. The Saudis would argue it's just a smart sports strategy to be visible, and then we can promote tourism, and it helps us make people aware of what Saudi Arabia is doing in sport and how it's growing. Whereas obviously critics would say it's all part of sports washing. You get soft power by partnering with FIFA, and then that gives you a seat at the table, and eventually it helps you dominate in the sports sector. And you're doing that because you ultimately want to paint a better image of Saudi Arabia, and that's the sports washing side. And again, I give both because I think we have to be very balanced on these things. So you've basically got PIF at the moment that are more hands-on and looking for a return on investment that usually, especially outside of sport, is quite tangible. Their investments outside of sport are there to make money and not be reliant on oil and gas. Whereas Aramco is the complete opposite. It is in oil and gas, and they are looking to sponsor, and they are looking to get a foot in the door at the highest possible level in return for dropping down a load of money. So they're not necessarily making money. What they're doing is dropping down money in order to get power for the benefit of either their sports strategy or, at the other extreme, sports washing. And the reason why I say it's like Newcastle and Sunderland, a sort of Saudi Tyne derby or whatever we want to call it, is because they're kind of on the same page in the sense that, yes, everyone wants Vision 2030 to succeed and the World Cup in 2034 to succeed, but Aramco go against Vision 2030 because Vision 2030 is about moving away from the area in which Aramco operate. And the second thing is that Aramco have got their own club in Saudi Arabia called Al Qadsiya, and the PIF ones are the big funded ones at the moment. And Al Qadsiya are about to be promoted to the Saudi Pro League. And when they are promoted to the Saudi Pro League, Aramco will fund their club and PIF will fund the 4 clubs they control. But PIF will predominantly still take central funds, whereas Aramco are expected to spend their own money. And Aramco will want to beat the PIF clubs and be better than the PIF clubs. So it's not necessarily about everyone pulling together. In many ways, it's the first test as to whether Saudi Arabia can fulfill a sports strategy with everyone genuinely getting on and genuinely pulling together, or are we going to see fractures? And if you look at the UAE, which is more advanced than Saudi Arabia, there's always been politics. There's always been problems between the royals in Abu Dhabi and the royals in the UAE. There's always been issues. You know, Abu Dhabi bought Manchester City, Arsenal made their ties to Dubai and Emirates, and there's little rifts, there's little issues. So it's all very well painting publicly this great, unified, all-encompassing strategy. But I know from living out there, there's always problems, there's always rifts. And anyone that's been out to the UAE will maybe remember a story I've told in the past about the Burj Khalifa that was supposed to be called the Burj Dubai, the world's tallest building. But Dubai ran out of money and they had to turn to Abu Dhabi to finish the building. It would have been very embarrassing if they couldn't complete the world's tallest building. And Sheikh Khalifa basically said, I'll give you the money, but it can't be called the Burj Dubai. It's got to be named after me. It's got to be called the Burj Khalifa. So they changed the name of it. So there's a lot of politics and even pettiness at times. So I wouldn't look at Aramco's move as PIF-centric, even though it will be painted publicly as Saudi Arabia are unified, Saudi Arabia are doing this and that and the other in sport. I think still that we can classify PIF and Aramco as rivals on and off the field.
Okay, good answer to that question. Nathan says, Ben wrote an article earlier in the season saying that if we finished top 6, it would be a good season. That was when injuries were nowhere near as bad. If we do finish inside the top 6, would Ben agree it would be a fantastic achievement by Eddie Howe and the team, judging on the injuries that we've had?
Yeah, absolutely. I stand by, unsurprisingly, what I wrote. Yeah. And I wasn't foreseeing the injuries. I think I would have probably said top half would have been a good finish for Newcastle had I known the nature of Newcastle's injuries. And the thing you have to bear in mind is that last season, I wouldn't want to say it's an anomaly because that's disrespectful to Newcastle and what they achieved, but they were ahead of their strategic and financial targets by getting Champions League so quickly. And we know in the season after getting Champions League, Villa will likely find it next season. Leicester found it when they got into the Champions League. We know it's difficult because you're playing more games, and that had an impact, I think, for Newcastle in the first half of the season. And then the second half of the season, they've not had to play as many games because they didn't get out the group, but all of these injuries have kicked in. And the bottom line in all of this is that Arsenal, Manchester City and Liverpool were always, on paper, before a ball was kicked, going to be up there. And in my view anyway, above Newcastle United. And then Tottenham made an incredible start under Ange Postecoglou. Had they not done so, they'd be below Newcastle at this point, but they did. So it was obvious, I think, when you looked at Newcastle's first few games and Tottenham's first, let's say, 10 games, that they were going to be relatively difficult to catch. And although Tottenham are wavering in the wrong direction, and Newcastle might catch them because ultimately there's still 4 games to go, I think the amount of points Spurs were able to accrue early on when they were right at the top of the table suddenly made it very difficult for Newcastle United to break into that top 4. And then all the injuries kicked in. Chelsea are having a relatively okay second half to the season and in a purple patch at the moment. Manchester United were always going to be up there. And right before a ball was kicked, we needed to speak about West Ham being in the conversation as well. And they still might be, even though they're 9th in the table too. So given Newcastle's strategy was in 3 to 5 years to get Champions League football, the fact that they got it in that first year after flirting with relegation shouldn't make us say the bar goes so high that instead of being glad of any kind of European football or top 6 finish, if they aren't challenging for the Premier League or if they aren't comfortably in the top 4, it's a disaster season. They got up there, but that was ahead of where they expected to be. Now they're here, and that's still higher than they expected to be. And I think Newcastle United will be absolutely delighted if in 2 consecutive seasons they can get any European football back-to-back. Because then you've got a really good chance of getting it in 3 consecutive seasons. And once you get into Europe within 3 consecutive seasons, whatever kind of Europe it is, you can start planning a bit more for it. You can start spending a bit more. You can start stabilizing. And then you've got a really good chance of getting in the top 4 or potentially in future seasons, the top 5 and getting Champions League football. And suddenly Europe becomes the norm. And over time, Champions League becomes the norm. But that's not an overnight thing because as proven this season with the injuries, you need depth to get that. It's not just about your starting 11. It's not just about what you're capable of. I think sometimes fans just speak of, oh, Isak's got the goals and Gordon's lively and Bruno and Joe Linton are amazing and Botman's one of the best centre-backs in the league and Nick Pope is an incredible goalkeeper. So why are we not up there? Why are we not competing? Why are these players not at their best? But actually, along with, of course, all of that spine and all of that talent, you need a Miguel Almiron to recapture his form. You need the unsung players like maybe a Sean Longstaff or a Joe Willock. You need your young players like Tino Livramento and Lewis Hall. You need your backup goalkeeper like Martin Dubravka. And you need a strong bench, which is players like Lewis Miley if he's not starting, Matt Ritchie, Matt Targett, Karius potentially if Dubravka can't play in games. And that's where, even though these players are excellent servants to Newcastle or at the other extreme young talents, they're not the same, in my opinion, as looking at a Manchester City bench or even benches of sides that have been more inconsistent like Manchester United. And you're just not going to get that squad of 25 and that dynamic overnight. So if you look in comparison to the players that I've just mentioned from Newcastle's perspective, and then you look at the Manchester City bench in their last game against Forest, it had Haaland on it, it had Kovacic on it, it had Nunez on it, it had Bob, Stones and Rico Lewis on it, and no doubt others that I've not mentioned as well. So squad depth is as important as individual quality, and Newcastle don't quite have the squad depth in light of how many injuries they've had to deal with. So I think Eddie Howe's done a phenomenal job. And the truth is that if Newcastle finish 6th, that will be up there, in my opinion, with getting into the Champions League last season. If they finish 7th or 8th, so 8th even would miss out on European football. But even if they finish 7th or 8th and they're there or thereabouts, I still think that will be a very solid season. And with players recovering and hopefully a bit of transfer activity over the summer, it will give them a nice little platform to move forward. So all this talk maybe 10 games ago, 15 games ago, or perhaps it was over the festive period about Eddie Howe under pressure, Eddie Howe should be replaced. Nonsense, in my opinion. I think he's done an absolutely outstanding job. And I think this is another season that is a step forwards for Newcastle United in light of the injuries that they've had to deal with. And like I said before, we're not only talking about football, so everyone only looks at the football and where Newcastle are, but I look at the finances. And as I said, when Newcastle got Champions League, and I was hammered for it a bit because everyone said, why are you being so negative? Why are you talking about stabilization and consolidation? But the point is, PIF have got money. We know that. And Newcastle eventually will be able to spend, even though at this point it feels like they need to sell. We know that as well. But they're being cautious because until you get 1, 2, 3 seasons of consistent European football in your model, so we're only talking financially speaking, you don't want to budget for it. Because if you budget for it and then you don't get it, then it's money you've not planned for. So financial models are really conservative. Brighton got European football. They probably didn't even budget to finish 10th the following season. Newcastle got Champions League football. They probably only budgeted for top half. Leicester got Champions League. They budgeted for a bottom half finish. And that's not the football aim. That's the financial aim. And the financial aims are always down here and the football aims are always up here. So Eddie Howe next season is probably planning for top 5 or Europa League. But again, the financial projections will all be based on a 10th place finish because Newcastle don't want to overstretch. And if you're budgeting for a 10th place finish, it means it's less money for Eddie Howe to spend. So when Howe's thinking about selling and when Howe's speaking about not having that much leeway, it's because his CFO is smart and Darren Eales is smart and they're not overextending. But if they get 3 consecutive seasons of European football, they may say to Eddie Howe, now we're budgeting for 7th and Europa Conference League. And that means an extra 30 million, which means you can have 1 more player. And in 5 years' time, they may say, now, Eddie, we're budgeting for Champions League. So you can have an extra 80 million. And at that point, Howe will be able to move much freer in the market. So you have to earn the right for your CFO to give you that extra 50, 80, 100, 150 million based upon a consistency of top half or European or Champions League finishes. It's not just given to you overnight, because then if you get it and then don't get it the following season, you've overextended. And a smart or just a normal CEO will never allow for that. So there's a battle between the football aim and the financial aim. And eventually what you want, like Manchester United under Ferguson, like now Manchester City under Pep Guardiola, what you want is the default financial aim and the football aim to be the same, both Champions League. And that's the case at City, which is why they've got more money to spend across windows. That has historically been the case at Chelsea, which is why they need European football this season and why historically they was able to spend so big under Roman Abramovich. That's why Arsenal are suddenly able to buy Declan Rice and the other names that I mentioned, because they're in the Champions League and they expect to be in the Champions League again. And they are now going to be in the Champions League again. That's why Liverpool are going to be able to spend quite big in Arne Slot's first season, because again, they've got Champions League and they've recovered from not having Champions League last season. But Newcastle are smart because they got Champions League and now they don't. So imagine if they'd have budgeted for Champions League this season rather than only set it as a football aim, then you'd have got to the point where they may have had a massive spend last summer saying, great, we're in the Champions League. And what if this season they finish 8th or 9th? Then this summer would probably require them to sell Alexander Isak and Bruno Guimaraes. Whereas maybe now they'll be able to keep hold of both players. So the CFO at Newcastle is very smart, very conservative, in my opinion, and is approaching things right. It's not what the fans want to hear. But in light of all of that, Eddie Howe is slightly more handcuffed than some of his other managerial rivals competing for European spots. So then when you add the injuries to the mix as well, I think it all adds up to a very, very good season for Newcastle, even though at the moment they are 7th in the table.
Okay, last question for today. Martin, he said, can you ask Ben his 3 summer signings for Newcastle if he was the manager?
Ooh, 3 summer signings for Newcastle. It's a difficult one. I think they need another forward, and that might be just because Callum Wilson's time could be up or his role could be diminished. I think if they could get in the conversation for Benjamin Sesko, then that would be a very good signing. And as I've reported many times, Manchester United and Arsenal and Chelsea and PSG are in the mix there. So that's number one. He's got a £43 million or 50 million euros release clause. I'm not aware of anything advanced at this point. I think that if Bruno was to go, but even if he stayed, we know that Eddie Howe has looked for a central midfielder, a box-to-box midfielder, and many have linked Newcastle in the past with Calvin Phillips. I think they'd be better served entering the conversation for Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall, who says he wants to stay at Leicester, and hopefully he's true to his word. But I think that given Leicester's financial situation, he might be available for under 40 million. Brentford and Brighton and Manchester United are the 3 clubs that have looked. But I think Newcastle could be well served to bring in a player like that. They've already got Harvey Barnes from Leicester, who had a good season in his last campaign in the Premier League for Leicester before joining Newcastle. And Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall's really added goals and assists to his game, due largely to the departure of both Barnes and James Maddison. So I think that he might be one just to keep an eye on, even though I'm not aware that Newcastle have entered that race. And then we know that they're looking for a centre-back. And I think if they can get Tosin, that would be a great signing on a relatively average wage within the Newcastle structure and a free transfer. And reports, by the way, to my knowledge, as I've reported, that that's done with Newcastle or close with Newcastle are not correct. I don't think he's decided his next club yet. I would keep an eye on Spurs and Liverpool and Chelsea and Milan and Newcastle, but it's a battle to convince him. And he may well look at the league table at the end of the season to determine what he's going to get. So Chelsea and Newcastle might be competing for the last European spot. And if he wants to play European football, maybe that is a consideration. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that one. But if Newcastle got Tosin for a free, Dewsbury-Hall for 35 million and Benjamin Sesko for 50 million, but then hypothetically, and don't shout at your screens, I'm just saying hypothetically, offset that with Bruno Guimaraes leaving, then you've got 100 million in and you've basically spent 80 million and you've put the other 20 million towards PSR, and you've got 3 players, central defender, central midfielder, talented young striker, but you've lost Bruno. But you still got Tonali back from his ban. Joe Linton can play in midfield as opposed to attack. You got Elliot Anderson, you got Lewis Miley, you got Sean Longstaff, you got Joe Willock. There's plenty of midfielders in that 3. And you've just signed another midfielder in Dewsbury-Hall. I don't think, as much as people fixate on Bruno and how he's right at the top of valuable, incredible, integral players to Newcastle. So I'm not devaluing that. And again, I stress very clearly, Newcastle don't want to sell Guimaraes. But if I gave you an either or, Guimaraes can go. You can alleviate PSR concerns. You can have Tosin, you can have Dewsbury-Hall, and you can have Sesko. Or you can have to find PSR elsewhere and you keep Bruno, but then you can barely sign anyone in the market. I think that's a very close call. And I'd be inclined to say, okay, we'll sacrifice Bruno. We'll put 20 million towards PSR and we'll get a striker, a central midfielder and a centre-back. Thank you very much. I think Newcastle are stronger that way than keeping Bruno, signing nobody and worrying about PSR. That's just my opinion. I'm not saying it is that either or, but this is why, even though all the messaging is they don't want to sell Bruno, under the right circumstances, it might just make sense.
Prediction for the Burnley-Newcastle game, please, Ben, to finish off.
Oh, I think Newcastle are going to win that game. I don't see any problems. Burnley have had a little bit of a resurgence and it is away from home. And we know that Newcastle have struggled there. And it's tough also because it's getting to the stage where if Burnley lose that game and results go against them, then they're pretty much dead in the water. If they win that game, they can come out of the relegation zone. But it's just as important for Newcastle in the race for 6th place. So I think Newcastle will win that 3-1.
Good stuff, Ben. As always, thanks for joining us. Take care, mate. Speak to you soon.
All the best, everyone. Good luck at the weekend.